You ever wonder what it takes to make the impossible happen? What kind of courage burns inside someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose? Tonight, I'm bringing you a story so extraordinary, so audacious, that when I first discovered it buried in the archives of the Library of Congress, I had to read it 3 times just to believe it was real. This isn't just another chapter in history books. This is about a woman who did something that should have been impossible in 1856 America. A woman who looked at the most powerful man in the nation and refused to be silent. Her name was Elizabeth Freeman Cole, and what she did on a cold November night changed everything. But here's the thing that gets me every single time I think about this story. She knew exactly what would happen to her. She knew the price. And she wrote that letter anyway. If you want to discover stories that shake you to your core, that remind you what real courage looks like, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to dive into something that will stay with you long after this video ends. I've got documents here that most people have never seen. Letters that were hidden for over a century. And testimony that will make you question everything you thought you knew about resistance in antebellum America. Stay with me until the very end, because the twist in this story, nobody sees it coming. The ruins still stand on the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia, just 8 miles from the president's house. Thornhill Plantation. 300 acres of tobacco fields that once made Senator Marcus Blackwood one of the wealthiest men in the Commonwealth. Now the main house is nothing but blackened timber and crumbling brick, strangled by Virginia creeper and haunted by the ghosts of what happened there in the winter of 1856. If you walk through those ruins today, you can still smell it in the soil. That particular scent of old violence, of earth that drank too much suffering. The wind moves through the skeletal remains of the slave quarters differently than it moves through the rest of the property. It moans. It remembers. On the kitchen hearth, archaeologists found something in 1923 that they couldn't explain. A brass letter seal, melted and fused to the stone. The inscription barely visible. Truth unbound. Nobody understood what it meant. Not then. But in the cramped reading room of the National Archives, there exists a folder marked Correspondence Received, Executive Mansion, November 1856, unprocessed. Inside that folder, written in the most precise, elegant handwriting you've ever seen, is a letter that begins, Mr. President, I write to you not as a slave writes to her master, but as one soul writes to another, in the sight of God who sees all wickedness and will not be mocked. The woman who wrote those words was not supposed to know how to read. She was not supposed to know that the president's house stood less than a day's ride from where she slept on a dirt floor. She was not supposed to understand that senators could be held accountable, that newspapers existed, that the North was watching the South with increasing horror. But Elizabeth Freeman Cole understood all of it. And she understood something else, too. She understood that some truths are so dangerous, so incendiary, that speaking them aloud is the same as lighting a match in a room filled with gunpowder. This is a story about what happens when silence becomes more unbearable than death. When a woman with nothing decides that her voice, just once, matters more than her survival. If you want to accompany more cases like this, that shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. Thornhill Plantation operated like a machine designed to extract maximum profit from maximum suffering. Senator Blackwood owned 43 human beings in 1856. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white-columned, with imported Italian marble in the entrance hall and French crystal chandeliers in the dining room, where he entertained other senators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members. The slave quarters were exactly 140 yards behind the kitchen. 12 cabins, dirt floors, no windows, 1 fireplace shared between 2 families. In summer, the temperature inside reached 110 degrees. In winter, you could see your breath until April. The day began at 4:30 in the morning when the overseer, Thomas Ridley, rang the iron bell that hung outside the main barn. You had 15 minutes to reach the fields or face the lash. 20 lashes for the first offense, 40 for the second. After that, Ridley got creative. The tobacco fields stretched from the main road all the way to the Potomac River. Planting season ran from March to May. You worked bent over, pressing each seed into the earth with your thumb. 14 hours a day. Your back screaming, your hands bleeding. The overseer riding his horse up and down the rows, watching for anyone who straightened up too long, anyone who paused to wipe sweat from their eyes. Harvest season was worse. August through October. You had to cut each tobacco plant at the base, carry it to the drying barn, hang it from the rafters in the suffocating heat where the leaves cured. The smell of tobacco sap mixed with your own sweat until you couldn't tell them apart. You couldn't wash it off. It stained your skin, your clothes, your lungs. At night, you coughed up black phlegm. The children developed breathing problems by age 6. Senator Blackwood kept meticulous records. In his plantation ledger, archived at the Virginia Historical Society, each enslaved person is listed with their name, age, value, and specialty. Elizabeth, 28 years, won $200, house servant, literate, acquired from Williamsburg estate sale, 1851. That single word, literate. It should have been her death sentence right there. In Virginia in 1856, teaching a slave to read was illegal, punishable by 39 lashes for the slave, a fine of $100 for the teacher. But Elizabeth's previous owner, a widow named Catherine Hartwell, had been a Quaker who believed that denying education was a sin greater than breaking man's law. She taught Elizabeth to read using the family Bible, teaching her in secret every Sunday afternoon for 6 years. When Mrs. Hartwell died and her estate was liquidated, Elizabeth was sold at auction to the highest bidder. Senator Blackwood bought her specifically because she was literate. He needed someone who could manage his household correspondence, keep his social calendar, organize his library, prepare his speeches for dictation. She became his personal secretary in everything but title. She worked in his private study. She had access to his files, his letters from other senators, his financial records, his political strategy documents. She read newspapers from Boston, Philadelphia, New York. She saw the arguments being made by abolitionists. She read Frederick Douglass. She read William Lloyd Garrison. She read Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she said nothing. She kept her eyes down, her voice soft, her thoughts locked away where they couldn't get her killed. The house slaves occupied a different world than the field slaves, but don't mistake it for a better one. You were always watched, always performing. The senator's wife, Margaret Blackwood, had a particular cruelty that came from boredom and morphine addiction. She would test Elizabeth. Leave valuable items in obvious places to see if she would steal them. Ask her to read passages from books, then accuse her of reading them wrong, of being uppity, of forgetting her place. The punishment was usually being sent to work in the fields for a week. A reminder that education didn't make you human in their eyes. It just made you a more useful tool. But there was one space where Elizabeth found something close to freedom. Every Thursday evening, Senator Blackwood held a salon. Politicians, newspapermen, lawyers, foreign diplomats. They would drink bourbon, smoke cigars, and debate the issues of the day. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott case, the future of the Democratic Party. And Elizabeth would stand in the corner, silent and invisible, refilling their glasses, removing their plates, listening to every single word. She learned how power actually worked. Not from books, but from watching men who held it discuss how to keep it. She learned their strategies, their weaknesses, their fears. And slowly, over 5 years, she began to understand something that most enslaved people never had the chance to understand. The system was fragile. The men who ran it were terrified. They knew they were standing on top of a powder keg, and they spent every waking hour trying to convince themselves it would never explode. The other slaves trusted her with their secrets because she could move between worlds. When field hands needed messages sent to family members sold away to other plantations, Elizabeth would write the letters. When someone needed to know what the senator was planning, Whether he was about to sell someone or bring in a slave trader, Elizabeth would listen at his study door and report back. She became the community's eyes and ears, their recorder of truths that would otherwise be lost. But the weight of all those secrets, all that suffering witnessed and documented, was crushing her. Every night she would lie awake on her straw mattress in the tiny room off the kitchen, and she would feel the words building up inside her like pressure in a sealed container. One day, she knew, something would force them out. One day, silence would become impossible. The first atrocity Elizabeth witnessed at Thornhill came 3 weeks after her arrival in 1851. A field hand named Samuel, age 16, was accused of talking back to the overseer. The punishment took place in front of the assembled slaves on a Sunday morning after the senator returned from church. Ridley tied Samuel to the whipping post in the center of the quarters. 50 lashes. Elizabeth was forced to watch like everyone else. She counted each strike. She watched the skin split open. She watched Samuel's mother collapse, keening, held back by 2 men who knew that any attempt to intervene would mean death. When it was over, Ridley poured salt water over the wounds. "So he remembers," he said. Samuel couldn't work for 2 weeks. When he finally returned to the fields, he moved like an old man. He was 17 years old. The second atrocity was more calculated. In 1853, a woman named Grace became pregnant. The father was her husband, Daniel, who worked in the stables. They had been married for 3 years, jumping the broom in a ceremony witnessed by the entire slave community. When Senator Blackwood discovered the pregnancy, he sold Daniel to a cotton plantation in Alabama. Grace begged. She offered to work double shifts, to give up her rations, anything. The senator smiled. "A baby is an investment," he said. "A husband is a liability. He might get ideas about protecting you. Can't have that." Daniel was gone within a week. Grace gave birth alone. The baby, a girl, lived for 6 days before dying of fever. Grace never spoke again. Not a single word for the remaining 3 years Elizabeth knew her. The third atrocity happened in cycles, so regular you could set a calendar by it. Every 6 months, Senator Blackwood would select one of the younger women for what he called special service. The woman would be brought to the main house, bathed, dressed in a clean shift, and taken to the senator's private chambers. This would continue for a week, sometimes 2. Then she would be returned to the quarters, given a few coins, and warned that speaking about it would result in being sold south to the sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The woman would often become pregnant. If the child was light-skinned enough, it would be sold as soon as it could walk. If it was dark-skinned, it would be kept and raised as field stock. Elizabeth kept a private record of these violations, names, dates, outcomes. She hid the papers in a hollowed-out brick behind the kitchen hearth. She didn't know why she was keeping this record. She just knew that someone someday needed to know. These women's names needed to exist somewhere other than the senator's ledger where they were listed as property. Elizabeth watched all of this. She cataloged it. She felt it accumulating in her chest like stones. Each act of cruelty was another weight pressing down on her lungs until some mornings she could barely breathe. But she maintained her mask, soft voice, lowered eyes, efficient hands. She became so good at disappearing into the wallpaper that the senator would discuss his most private affairs in front of her, forgetting she was even in the room. She heard him laugh about a field hand who had been whipped for trying to learn his letters. She heard him strategize with other senators about defeating anti-slavery legislation. She heard him tell a dinner guest that the Negro is naturally suited to servitude, incapable of complex thought, happy in his simple existence. And she stood there, this woman who had read more books than most of the men at that table, who could write more eloquently, who could debate political philosophy with any of them, and she said nothing. But inside, something was changing. The stones were beginning to shift. The pressure was building toward a rupture. The trauma that broke Elizabeth Freeman Cole arrived on March 15, 1856. Her daughter Ruth was 10 years old. Ruth had been born during Elizabeth's time with Mrs. Hartwell before the auction. She was the child of another house slave, a man named Thomas, who had died of pneumonia when Ruth was 3. Ruth was small for her age, delicate, with her mother's intelligent eyes and quick hands. Elizabeth had hidden Ruth's brightness the way you hide a candle in a storm. Never let her read in front of others. Never let her ask too many questions. Never let the senator notice that she was anything more than another piece of property to be used when she reached breeding age. But children can't hide their nature forever. On that March morning, Ruth made a mistake. She was helping Elizabeth in the senator's study, dusting the bookshelves. A volume of poetry fell open, and Ruth, forgetting herself for just one moment, began reading aloud. "The world is too much with us, late and soon." Her voice was clear, perfect pronunciation, natural rhythm. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. She looked up and saw the senator standing in the doorway, watching. "Well," he said softly, "the child can read." Elizabeth stepped forward, placing herself between him and Ruth. "Senator, please. She doesn't understand what she's doing. She's just mimicking sounds." "Don't insult my intelligence, Elizabeth. That child is reading Wordsworth with better diction than most Yale graduates." He walked closer. Elizabeth could smell the bourbon on his breath even though it was 10 in the morning. "You taught her, broke the law, made her dangerous." He smiled, and Elizabeth saw her entire world collapsing. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'm not going to whip you. I'm not even going to sell you. I'm going to give you a choice." The choice was this. Elizabeth could continue working in the house, maintaining her position of relative privilege, her access to books and information and warmth. Or she could be sent to the fields, reduced to the same brutal existence as the other slaves. "But," the senator continued, "the child goes. Tomorrow. I've already arranged the sale. Plantation in Georgia. They need young ones for the cotton fields. She'll fetch a good price." Elizabeth fell to her knees. She begged. She offered herself in any way he wanted. She promised silence, obedience, anything. The senator just watched her grovel with the detached interest of a man watching an insect struggle. "The decision is made," he said. "You have tonight to say goodbye." That night, Elizabeth held Ruth in the tiny room off the kitchen. She tried to explain what was happening, tried to prepare her daughter for what Georgia cotton fields meant. 10-year-old children working 18-hour days, overseers with whips, survival rates that made Virginia tobacco plantations look merciful. Ruth didn't understand. She kept asking when she would see her mother again. "Soon," Elizabeth lied. "Very soon, baby." They sat together until dawn, Elizabeth memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. The small scar above her left eyebrow where she had fallen as a toddler, the way her hair curled at her temples, the sound of her breathing. At sunrise, the slave trader arrived, a man named Cyrus Webb, known throughout Virginia for his brutality. He shackled Ruth with 5 other children, all under 12. They were loaded into a wagon with wooden sides so they couldn't jump out. Elizabeth ran after the wagon, screaming Ruth's name until the overseer dragged her back and locked her in the smokehouse for 3 days so she wouldn't disturb the senator's breakfast with her grief. When they finally let her out, Elizabeth walked to the slave cemetery on the far edge of the property. She knelt in the red clay among the unmarked graves. She stayed there for 6 hours, not praying, not crying, just kneeling. When she finally stood up, she was different. The woman who had survived by silence, by accommodation, by making herself small and useful, was gone. What remained was something harder, something that understood there are things worse than death. There are silences that eat you from the inside out. There are compromises that kill you in ways that have nothing to do with the body. She walked back to the quarters and sat down at the small table where she had taught Ruth her letters in secret. She took out a piece of paper she had stolen from the senator's study. She took out the pen and ink she had hidden in the brick behind the hearth, and she began to write. Not to God, not to some abstract future, but to the one man in America who had the power to make Senator Marcus Blackwood answer for his crimes. She began to write to President Franklin Pierce. Senator Marcus Blackwood was not a simple villain. He was a fourth-generation Virginian, descended from tobacco aristocracy that traced its lineage back to the Jamestown settlement. He had graduated from the College of William and Mary, served 2 terms in the Virginia House of Delegates, and won his Senate seat in 1853 by a comfortable margin. He was considered a moderate on the slavery question, not an abolitionist, of course. That would be political suicide in Virginia, but not a fire-eater either. He opposed the immediate expansion of slavery into new territories, favored gradual colonization schemes, spoke publicly about the necessary evil of the institution while privately building his fortune on it. His specialty was cruelty disguised as paternalism. He would tell visitors that he treated his slaves well, that they were fed adequately, housed reasonably, punished only when necessary for discipline. He would point to Elizabeth as proof of his enlightened approach. "I even allow her to read," he would say, as if literacy was a gift he bestowed, rather than a fundamental human right he denied. He believed his own propaganda. He genuinely thought himself a benevolent master. The cognitive dissonance required to sell a 10-year-old child while believing yourself enlightened is staggering, but Senator Blackwood managed it with ease. His political power came from his connections. He sat on the Senate Committee on Territories, giving him influence over the expansion of slavery into Kansas and Nebraska. He was personal friends with President Pierce, a fellow Democrat who shared his view that preserving the Union required appeasing the South. Blackwood regularly attended state dinners at the president's house. He vacationed with cabinet members. He knew everyone who mattered in Washington's political establishment. But there was another antagonist in this story, one whose cruelty was more direct, more visceral. Thomas Ridley, the overseer. Ridley was a poor white from the Virginia Piedmont who had worked his way up from field hand to supervisor through demonstrated brutality. He was 35 years old, built like a bull, with scarred knuckles and a face that looked like it had been carved from old leather. He carried a whip braided from cowhide, 9 feet long, with a popper at the end that could take the skin off your back in a single stroke. He had used that whip so many times that his right arm was more developed than his left, giving him a lopsided appearance. Ridley's cruelty came from a different place than the senators. Blackwood was cruel from a position of absolute power and indifference. Ridley was cruel from insecurity and rage. He knew that in the social hierarchy of the South, he was barely above the people he brutalized. He owned no land. He had no education. His only power came from his willingness to inflict suffering on people who couldn't fight back. He was the kind of man who would whip a slave for looking at him wrong, then go home and weep into his whiskey because he knew he would die poor and forgotten. His violence was the violence of a man who hated himself and took it out on anyone weaker. There were others, too. Margaret Blackwood, the senator's wife, whose addiction to morphine made her unpredictable and vicious. She would alternate between weeping fits where she apologized to the slaves for the institution that trapped them all, and rages where she would strike them with whatever object was nearest. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the senator's personal physician, who would conduct medical experiments on the enslaved population without anesthesia, testing treatments that he would later use on white patients. His particular specialty was gynecological procedures performed on women who had no right to refuse. The Reverend Jonathan Cross, pastor of the Episcopal Church where the senator worshipped, who preached that slavery was ordained by God, that Africans bore the curse of Ham, that resistance to bondage was resistance to divine will. But the catalyst, the event that transformed Elizabeth's plan from abstract possibility to immediate necessity, came on October 12, 1856. News reached Thornhill that Ruth had died. The details were sparse. A letter from the Georgia plantation owner to Senator Blackwood discussing the loss of property and requesting compensation for the defective merchandise. Ruth had lasted 7 months. She had died of exhaustion and dysentery. Common causes among children worked to death in cotton fields. Her body had been buried in an unmarked grave with 30 other slaves who had died that season. The plantation owner noted, almost as an afterthought, that the child had called for her mother at the end, Elizabeth received this news while serving dinner to the senator and 6 guests. One of the guests mentioned reading the letter, expressed mild sympathy for the business loss. Elizabeth's hands didn't shake as she poured the wine. Her face didn't change expression. She finished serving the meal, cleared the plates, retired to the kitchen. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to feel it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked to the hearth where she had hidden her documents, pulled out the brick, and looked at the letter she had been writing for 6 months. The letter to President Pierce. It was nearly complete. She had drafted it and redrafted it, trying to find the words that would make him see. Now she understood. There were no perfect words. There was only truth, raw and terrible. She would finish the letter tonight, and she would find a way to deliver it, no matter the cost. 3 days after learning of Ruth's death, Elizabeth was accused of theft. A gold brooch belonging to Margaret Blackwood had gone missing from her dressing room. Elizabeth was the obvious suspect. She had access. She had motive. She could sell it and use the money to escape. The accusation was, of course, completely fabricated. Margaret Blackwood had hidden the brooch herself, either in a morphine-induced fog or with deliberate malice. It didn't matter. The trial, if you could call it that, lasted 5 minutes in the senator's study. "Did you take my wife's brooch?" he asked. "No, sir." "Are you calling my wife a liar?" There was no correct answer to that question. "No, sir." "Then you're admitting you took it." The punishment was public whipping. 20 lashes, administered by Ridley in front of the assembled slaves. The message was clear. This is what happens when you forget your place. Elizabeth was stripped to the waist and tied to the post. She could see the other slaves watching, their faces carefully blank. She could see Margaret Blackwood watching from the porch of the main house, a slight smile on her morphine-dulled face. The first lash felt like fire, the second like a blade. By the 10th, she had bitten through her bottom lip trying not to scream. By the 20th, she had stopped counting. When they cut her down, she couldn't stand. 2 women dragged her back to her room and tended her wounds with what little they had, rags soaked in salt water, prayers whispered in Yoruba and English and Igbo. Elizabeth lay on her stomach for 3 days, feeling the wounds seep and crust and slowly begin to heal. On the 4th day, she stood up. She could barely move her shoulders. Every breath felt like her back was splitting open again. She walked to the small mirror in her room, a fragment of glass she had salvaged years ago, and looked at what they had done to her. The scars would be permanent, raised welts that would never fully fade. She traced them with her fingers, memorizing the pattern. Then she got dressed and went back to work. But something fundamental had shifted. She had been humiliated in front of everyone she knew. She had been marked, branded as a thief, as someone who couldn't be trusted. The other slaves looked at her differently now, some with pity, some with suspicion. Maybe she really had stolen the brooch. The house of secrets and small rebellions that she had built over 5 years was collapsing. She was losing the community's trust just as she needed it most. That night, she made her decision. She would finish the letter. She would find a way to get it to President Pierce. And she would include everything, not just Ruth's death, not just her own suffering, but documentation of every crime committed at Thornhill Plantation, names, dates, descriptions of atrocities, a complete accounting of Senator Marcus Blackwood's sins, written in prose so precise and damning that even President Pierce, who owed his political career to Southern support, would not be able to ignore it. She knew what this meant. Once the letter was sent, there would be no going back. She would be discovered. She would be punished in ways that made whipping look merciful. But Ruth was dead. Her daughter was in an unmarked grave in Georgia. There was nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. Everything after this was just details. Elizabeth needed allies. Not many. Too many people meant too many chances for betrayal. But she needed at least 3. Someone who could move freely outside the plantation, someone who understood Washington politics, and someone who could get a letter into the president's house without being caught. The first recruit was Moses Grant, a free black man who ran a small smithy on the Alexandria waterfront. Moses had purchased his freedom 15 years earlier and now served the white community as a skilled metal worker while quietly supporting the Underground Railroad. Elizabeth had met him 2 years ago when Senator Blackwood sent her to Alexandria to purchase iron fittings for the plantation. They had spoken for less than 5 minutes, but Moses had recognized something in her eyes. He had pressed a small piece of paper into her hand with an address. "If you ever need help," he had whispered. She had kept that paper hidden in the brick behind the hearth, next to her other documents. Now she would use it. Elizabeth's second trip to Alexandria came in early November. She told the senator she needed to purchase supplies for the household: thread, needles, lamp oil. He granted permission, distracted by upcoming Senate business. She walked the 8 miles into town, her back still aching from the whipping, and found Moses's smithy near the docks. When she showed him the letter, 37 pages of precise handwriting, documenting every atrocity at Thornhill, his hands trembled. "This could get us both killed," he said. "My daughter is already dead," Elizabeth replied. "I have nothing left they can take." Moses studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "I know a man. Works in the executive mansion as a porter. Free black, name of Henry Wallace. He delivers mail directly to the president's secretary. But he'll need protection, if this is traced back to him." "It won't be," Elizabeth said. "The letter is unsigned. No names except the senators. They'll know it came from someone at Thornhill, but they won't know who. They'll punish everyone." "I know." Moses was quiet. Then, "When?" "Thanksgiving, November 27th. The senator is hosting a dinner for 15 guests. Every slave on the plantation will be working. I'll be in the house. No one will notice I'm gone for an hour." The third conspirator was someone Elizabeth had never expected to trust: James Whitmore, a white journalist from the National Era, an abolitionist newspaper published in Washington. Whitmore had interviewed Senator Blackwood months earlier for a profile piece, and Elizabeth had served them tea in the study. Afterward, Whitmore had slipped her a card with his office address. "If you ever want to tell the real story," he had said quietly, "I'll print it." She had dismissed it at the time. Too dangerous, too naive. But now, with the letter written and delivery planned, she needed insurance. If the letter to President Pierce was intercepted or ignored, she needed a backup: the press. She met Whitmore in a colored church in Alexandria, the only place where a white man and an enslaved woman could speak without raising immediate suspicion. She gave him a copy of the letter. She had written it twice, once for the president, once for publication. "Print this the day after Thanksgiving," she told him. "Not before. If you publish too early, they'll know what's coming and stop it." Whitmore read the first page, then the second, his face growing pale. "My God, Elizabeth, this is... if even half of this is true. It's all true. Every word. I have witnesses. I have dates. I have the names of men who will corroborate if pressed. They'll deny it. Blackwood will say you're lying, that you're a disgruntled slave with a vendetta. Let him deny it in court. Let him deny it under oath. Let him explain to the Senate why his slave could write a 37-page letter with perfect grammar and historical citations. Let him explain Ruth." Whitmore folded the pages carefully. "This will destroy him." That's the idea. The plan was set. Moses would deliver the original letter to Henry Wallace on November 26th. Wallace would place it in President Pierce's daily correspondence on the morning of November 27th. By noon, the president would read it. By evening, Whitmore's newspaper would publish the full text. By midnight, Washington would be in chaos. Elizabeth spent the week before Thanksgiving preparing. She burned her drafts, destroyed evidence of her handwriting practice, hid her stolen paper and ink where they would never be found. She memorized every word of the letter so that even if they took it from her, she could reproduce it. She said goodbye to the people she cared about without telling them it was goodbye. She held longer conversations with the old women in the quarters, learning their stories. She played with the children, teaching them songs that contained hidden messages about resistance and memory. She stood in the tobacco fields at sunset and watched the light turn the Potomac River gold. On November 26th, Moses Grant made the delivery. The letter reached Henry Wallace's hands at 4 in the afternoon. Wallace slipped it into the president's incoming correspondence pile, buried between a petition from Ohio farmers and a request from a Maryland congressman. No one noticed. The trap was set. Thanksgiving morning at Thornhill Plantation began before dawn. 43 slaves worked to prepare a feast for Senator Blackwood's 15 guests: cabinet members, fellow senators, a Supreme Court justice, and foreign diplomats. Elizabeth managed the kitchen, coordinating the roasting of 3 turkeys, 2 hams, preparation of oyster stuffing, sweet potato casserole, cranberry relish, cornbread, biscuits, 4 different pies. The house had to be immaculate, the silver polished until it reflected like mirrors, fresh flowers in every room, a fire burning in each hearth. The guests began arriving at noon. Elizabeth moved through the house like a ghost, refilling wine glasses, removing plates, invisible and essential. She listened to their conversations, debates about Kansas, concerns about John Brown's recent activities, speculation about the next presidential election. Senator Blackwood was in rare form, holding court, telling jokes, playing the gracious host. At one point, he raised his glass in a toast. To the enduring Union, and to the wisdom of men who understand that some traditions must be preserved for the greater good. The guests applauded. Elizabeth stood in the corner, her face blank, her mind calculating. The letter had been in President Pierce's hands for approximately 6 hours now. He would have read it. His staff would have verified the accusations. Easy enough to do, since Senator Blackwood's political correspondence included references to selling Ruth, to punishing slaves, to his views on maintaining control. The president's response was unknowable. He might suppress it, protect his fellow Democrat. Or he might see an opportunity to distance himself from the pro-slavery extremists as political winds shifted northward. At precisely 8 o'clock, as dessert was being served, Elizabeth excused herself to the kitchen, then slipped out the back door. She walked the 8 miles to Alexandria in darkness, moving fast despite her still healing back. She reached Whitmore's office at 10:30. He was waiting, the printing press already set up. "It's done?" he asked. She nodded. He began typesetting immediately. The headline would read, "Letter from a Slave, the Horrors of Thornhill Plantation Exposed." By the time Elizabeth returned to Thornhill at 2 in the morning, the first copies of the National Era were being loaded onto wagons for distribution throughout Washington. By sunrise, the story would be everywhere. There was no stopping it now. The response came faster than anyone expected. On November 28th, President Pierce issued a terse statement acknowledging receipt of correspondence alleging misconduct by a member of the Senate and promising a thorough investigation. Senator Blackwood, summoned to the executive mansion, denied everything. He claimed the letter was a forgery, the work of abolitionist agitators trying to smear his reputation. But the details in the letter were too specific, too accurate. The sale of Ruth to the Georgia plantation was documented in his own ledger. The names of guests at his Thursday salons were correct. The descriptions of Thornhill's layout were precise. The newspapers seized the story. The abolitionist press in the North treated Elizabeth's letter as a revelation, proof of slavery's essential evil. The pro-slavery press in the South called it a hoax, demanded Elizabeth be found and punished. Moderates were trapped in the middle, unable to dismiss the letter's claims but unwilling to condemn one of their own. Within 48 hours, Senator Blackwood was the most talked-about man in America. At Thornhill, chaos erupted. Federal marshals arrived to investigate. They interviewed slaves, examined records, searched for the letter's author. Elizabeth maintained perfect composure. When questioned, she claimed illiteracy, said she knew nothing. But Ridley, the overseer, wasn't fooled. He had seen her in the senator's study, seen her handle books and papers, On December 1st, he locked her in the smokehouse and began his own interrogation. The beating lasted 3 hours. Ridley used fists, not the whip. Bruises fade faster than scars, leave less evidence. He demanded she confess. She refused. He broke 2 of her ribs. She refused. He threatened to kill her. She looked him in the eye and said, "Then kill me. But the letter is already published. The damage is done. You can't undo it." Ridley reported to Senator Blackwood that Elizabeth was the likely culprit, but that he couldn't prove it. The senator faced an impossible choice. If he punished her without proof, he would confirm the letter's allegations about his brutality. If he did nothing, he would look weak. He chose a middle path. He sold her. On December 8th, Elizabeth Freeman Cole was auctioned in Alexandria to a plantation in South Carolina, far from Washington's scrutiny. But the letter continued to spread. It was reprinted in dozens of newspapers. Abolitionist groups read it aloud at meetings. Ministers quoted it from pulpits. The exact wording, the precise documentation, the educated voice, it shattered the myth of the contented slave, the happy servant grateful for white benevolence. Here was a woman who could write better than most senators, who understood politics and law, who had lived in the heart of the system and exposed its rotting core. Senator Blackwood's political career imploded. Facing pressure from Northern Democrats who needed distance from scandal, he resigned his Senate seat on January 15, 1857. He retreated to Thornhill, a broken man, his reputation destroyed. The plantation itself became infamous. Visitors would ride past, pointing at the place where the letter was written. Abolitionists made pilgrimages. The property value collapsed. And Elizabeth? She disappeared into the slave markets of the Deep South. Some records suggest she reached South Carolina. Others claim she escaped during transport, aided by Underground Railroad conductors who knew her story. There are accounts of a woman matching her description teaching literacy in secret to slaves in Georgia in 1858. There are reports of an Elizabeth participating in slave revolts in Mississippi in 1859. The truth is lost to history. But the letter survived. The original, hand-delivered to President Pierce, is preserved in the National Archives. It's written in ink that has faded to sepia brown, on paper that crackles when touched. 37 pages of precise handwriting, documenting the undocumented, giving voice to the voiceless. Historians debate its impact. Some argue it was a minor footnote, overshadowed by larger events like Bleeding Kansas and the Dred Scott decision. Others claim it was a turning point, proof that slavery corrupted everything it touched, even senators and presidents. What is beyond debate is this. Elizabeth Freeman Cole wrote a letter that should have been impossible. An enslaved woman with no legal standing, no rights, no power, reached across the barrier of bondage and spoke directly to the most powerful man in America. She forced him to acknowledge her humanity. She forced the nation to reckon with its own hypocrisy. For one brief moment, she made the invisible visible. The legends began almost immediately. Slaves on nearby plantations whispered that Elizabeth had been protected by spirits, that her ancestors had guided her hand as she wrote. They said the letter had been written in invisible ink that only righteous eyes could read, that President Pierce had wept when he saw it. They said Elizabeth had vanished in a column of fire, ascending like Elijah, leaving only her words behind. They said her ghost still walked Thornhill's ruins, keeping watch, making sure her story would never be forgotten. In the 1920s, archaeologists excavating the Thornhill site found the brick behind the kitchen hearth. Inside were papers, fragments of earlier drafts, practice pages where Elizabeth had perfected her handwriting, copies of letters she had written for other slaves. They found the brass seal engraved with "Truth Unbound," melted and fused to the hearthstone. Some believed she had thrown it into the fire before leaving, destroying evidence. Others believed it had been placed there deliberately, a marker, a gravestone for courage. Folklorists collected stories from descendants of Thornhill slaves. They spoke of a woman who could read the stars, who knew the future, who had made a bargain with truth itself. "She traded her life for her words," one old woman said in 1934. "Knew she wouldn't survive it, but didn't matter. Some things got to be said even if saying them kills you." Academic historians debated the letter's authenticity for decades. How could an enslaved woman produce such sophisticated prose? Surely it was ghostwritten by white abolitionists, they argued. Then linguists analyzed the text and found patterns consistent with someone who learned to read from the King James Bible and 18th century poetry. Exactly Elizabeth's documented education. They found references to events and conversations that only someone inside Thornhill could have known. The verdict, genuine. The letter was exactly what it claimed to be. In black churches throughout the South, Elizabeth's story became parable. Preachers would tell children about the woman who wrote truth to power, who refused to be silenced, who understood that some battles are worth losing if they're worth fighting. She didn't win her freedom, the preachers would say, but she won something bigger. She won her voice, and nobody, not even death, could take that away. Historians estimate that Elizabeth's letter influenced at least 17 other slaves to attempt similar communications with government officials between 1857 and 1861. Most were caught and punished. A few succeeded. Their letters, preserved in archives, all reference Elizabeth's example. One, written by a man named Isaiah in 1859, ends with, "I write in the spirit of the woman who wrote before me, who showed that we are not silent because we have nothing to say, but because we are not allowed to speak. Today I speak. Let God judge what happens next." The National Era continued publishing Elizabeth's letter annually on Thanksgiving, until the newspaper shut down in 1860. Each reprinting reached new audiences. Frederick Douglass mentioned it in speeches. Harriet Tubman carried a copy in her jacket during rescue missions. John Brown reportedly read it aloud to his followers in Kansas. Whether these stories are literally true or mythologized doesn't diminish their power. Elizabeth's words became ammunition in the war against slavery, evidence that the institution could not be reformed or made humane, that it had to be destroyed completely. When the Civil War began in 1861, Union officers discovered copies of the letter circulating among enslaved populations in Virginia and Maryland. They used it as propaganda, proof that the Confederacy was built on systematic cruelty. Confederate authorities tried to suppress it, burning copies, punishing anyone caught reading it. The letter's very existence became an act of resistance, a weapon that couldn't be confiscated or destroyed because it lived in too many minds, had been copied too many times, had spread too far to contain. After the war, during Reconstruction, literacy programs for freed slaves often used Elizabeth's letter as a teaching text. Students would practice reading it aloud, learning not just words but the power of words, the idea that literacy was not just a skill but a form of freedom. Teachers reported that elderly former slaves would weep when they heard the letter read, recognizing their own stories in Elizabeth's testimony. The last confirmed sighting of someone claiming to be Elizabeth Freeman Cole came in 1889. An elderly black woman, approximately 63 years old, appeared at a freedmen's school in Atlanta. She donated a small leather-bound book containing handwritten copies of abolitionist speeches and Bible verses. The inscription read, "For those who come after, remember that silence is a choice. EFC." The headmaster tried to ask her questions, but she disappeared before he could learn more. Whether this was actually Elizabeth or someone honoring her memory remains unknown. Today, the National Archives preserves her letter in climate-controlled storage. Scholars can request to view it, though they must wear gloves and cannot photograph it directly. The paper is fragile, the ink fading, but the words remain clear. 37 pages of testimony that changed history, a voice that refused to be erased. At the site of Thornhill Plantation, now a Virginia state park, there is a historical marker. It reads, "Here stood Thornhill Plantation, where in 1856 an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Freeman Cole wrote a letter to President Franklin Pierce exposing the realities of slavery. Her courage in speaking truth to power helped turn the nation's conscience toward abolition. Though her final fate remains unknown, her words survive as testament to the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. Visitors leave flowers at the marker, stones, notes, small offerings to a woman who gave everything to make her voice heard. The ruins of the main house are gone now, reclaimed by forest, but the brick hearth where she hid her writings still stands. Archaeologists have refused to move it, declaring it a sacred site. On Thanksgiving, people gather there to read the letter aloud, keeping the tradition alive, making sure Elizabeth Freeman Cole's impossible story continues to echo across generations. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly cares about searching for historical truth. Like this video if Elizabeth's story touched your heart. Share it so her memory is never forgotten.